Hello everyone! Today, I'd like to go over a budget commander deck that I've built around Soul of Windgrace, a Jund commander printed back in Dominaria United. I've designed this deck to cost less than $45 at the time of recording, using prices listed by Scryfall, which includes basic lands at 10 cents each, but it doesn't include the cost of shipping, taxes, and the like. And as always, the link to the deck list is in the description down below. Now let's get into this deck. Soul of Windgrace is a 4/5 legendary cat avatar for a generic, a black, a red, and a green mana, and lets you put a land from the graveyard onto the battlefield tapped whenever Soul of Windgrace enters the battlefield or attacks. Soul of Windgrace also has 3 activated abilities. Discarding a land with a green mana lets you gain 3 life, discarding a land with a red and a generic mana lets you draw, so essentially giving all of our lands cycling for 1 and a red, and if you discard a land with 2 generic and a black, Soul of Windgrace gets indestructible until the end of the turn, and is tapped if it isn't already, giving you some commander protection printed right on the commander. So Soul of Windgrace is definitely a lands matter commander, and will want lands to be a central aspect of the deck. Let's go a little bit more in depth on what this particular deck wants to do. So as alluded to earlier, about half this deck is going to be lands, with a large proportion of those being utility lands. Additionally, as we'll want to be able to return lands from our graveyard, we'll also want to make use of some self-sacrificing lands that we can bring back to use again. We can also use some cycling lands, though preferably with cycling costs lower than that provided by our commander. With some lands in our graveyard, we'll be looking to use our commander to get multiple lands onto the battlefield each turn, so we'll also be using a bunch of Landfall cards so we can get some extra value from these land drops, including things like token generation and some interaction. And since we're often going to have a fairly wide board from Landfall creature token generation, and be predominantly swinging for damage, we'll be looking to give our creatures Trample and have some Tramplers that get big with the lands. But that's enough of a preamble. Let's start digging into our 99, starting with our ramp. And frankly, all of our ramp is going to be land-based, so starting with Wayfarer's Bauble, Rampant Growth, and Edge of Autumn, each letting us tutor a basic land onto the battlefield tapped. Edge of Autumn requires us to have less than 5 lands in order to cast, and can be cycled by sacrificing a land, which in most decks would not be that great, but with Soul of Windgrace, this can give us another way to get lands into our graveyard to recur during combat. Kodama's Reach and Cultivate are basically reskins of each other, having you tutor 2 basic lands, which you reveal, put one onto the battlefield tapped, and put the other into your hand. And Path of the Animus tutors 2 basic lands directly onto the battlefield tapped. Then Harrow has us tutor 2 basic lands onto the battlefield, not tapped, but it also requires you to sacrifice a land, but we can recur that later with Soul of Windgrace. Open the Way can be used to dig down for 1 to 4 lands for between 3 to 6 mana, as it has you reveal cards from the top of your library until you run into X lands, with X being part of the mana spent casting, but X can't be greater than the number of players in the game. Animus Awakening is, in a way, ramp, but it is also really great for getting a large number of landfall triggers late game, as it is an X cost spell that has you reveal X cards from the top of your library, and you put all lands revealed this way onto the battlefield tapped, putting the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. However, if you happen to have 2 or more instants or sorceries in your graveyard when casting, those lands enter untapped. And finally, we have Splendid Reclamation, which like Animus Awakening can be a form of ramp, but may be best used for a bunch of landfall triggers late in the game when we've discarded and sacked a bunch of lands throughout the game, as it returns all lands from our graveyard to the battlefield tapped. But now that we have a number of ways to get extra lands onto the battlefield, let's go over some landfall cards to get some extra value from these drops. First up are Tireless Provisioner and Tireless Tracker, the former making a food or treasure token when a land enters the battlefield under your control, and the latter making a clue token. Additionally, whenever you sack a clue token, Tireless Tracker gets a +1/+1 counter. We also have Tunneling Geopede and Retreat to Hagra, the former dealing 1 damage to each opponent whenever we have a land enter the battlefield, and the latter lets us choose between draining our opponents for 1 life and us gaining 1, or giving a creature +1 power and death touch for the turn. Then for creature token generation, we can start with Scute Swarm, which is likely one of the best cards in this deck, where, at the start, it just makes a 1/1 insect creature token when a land enters the battlefield under your control. But if you control 6 or more lands, you instead make a token copy of Scute Swarm, and once that starts, your token generation can get out of hand fast, as each land doubles the number of Scute Swarms we have. Spore Mound and Zendikar's Royal make 1/1 Saprotlings and 2/2 Elementals when a land enters the battlefield under our control, respectively. And Rampaging Baloths is a 6/6 Trampler that makes 4/4 Beasts off of landfall. Omnath, Locus of Rage, makes a 5/5 Elemental upon landfall, and whenever Omnath or another elemental we control is dealt with, Omnath deals 3 damage to any target. And finally, we have Avenger of Zendikar and Phylath, World Sculptor, with Avenger of Zendikar making a 0/1 plant for each land you control when it enters the battlefield, and Phylath makes a 0/1 plant for each basic land we control when it enters the battlefield. Avenger of Zendikar also puts a +1/+1 counter on each plant you control when a land enters the battlefield under your control, and Phylath puts 4 +1/+1 counters on a target plant when a land enters the battlefield under your control. However, these creatures and creature tokens lack any form of evasion. So let's look at some trampling creatures and spells that give our entire board trample. First up are Territorial Scythecat and Oran Reef Hydra, tramplers that gain +1/+1 counters whenever a land enters the battlefield under our control. And for Oran Reef Hydra, it gains 2 +1/+1 counters if the land was a forest. We also have Crash of Rhino Beetles, a 5/5 trampler that, if we control 10 or more lands, which isn't a particularly tall order for this deck, it gets +10/+10, making it a 15/15 trampler. But these creatures just have trample themselves. To start spreading the trample around, we can start with Mina and Den, Wildborn, which can give a target creature trample for the turn by paying green, red, and returning a land you control to its owner's hand. But they also let us play an additional land each turn. Overrun and Endray's Forerunners give all of our creatures trample for the turn, with Overrun additionally giving our creatures +3/+3, and Endray's Forerunners giving +2/+2 and Vigilance, itself being a 7/7 with Vigilance, Trample, and Haste. And then we have Aggressive Mammoth, Thunderfoot Baloth, and Glorious Sunrise. Aggressive Mammoth is an 8/8 trampler that also gives our other creatures trample. Thunderfoot Baloth requires us to control our commander, but provided we do, it gives our entire board +2/+2, including itself, and gives the rest of our board trample, as it already has trample itself. And Glorious Sunrise lets us choose one of 4 modes at the start of our combat, giving our creatures +1/+1 and trample for the turn, letting a land tap for 3 green mana for the turn, drawing a card, provided we control a creature with power 3 or greater, or gaining 3 life. But that first mode is the real reason that it's here. But with that, let's move on to some interaction spells to let us deal with some problems our opponents may throw at us. Return to Nature gives us a few options, either destroying an artifact, destroying an enchantment, or giving us some graveyard hate, and Terminate lets us destroy a target creature. Feed the Swarm lets us destroy a target creature or enchantment, however there is the downside of us losing a life equal to that permanent's mana value, and Beast Within lets us destroy a target permanent, but that permanent's controller gets a 3/3 beast creature token. Archfiend of Ifnir makes it so whenever you cycle or discard a card, you put a -1/-1 counter on each creature your opponents control, which should give you a reasonable method to weaken and rid the board of some of your opponent's smaller creatures. Lavalanche and Clan Defiance are X mana spells dealing X damage, with Lavalanche dealing it to a target opponent or planeswalker, and each creature that player or planeswalker's controller controls. And Clan Defiance lets us choose to damage up to 1 target creature with flying, a target creature without flying, and or a target player or planeswalker. Riveteer's Confluence gives us some options, as we get to choose 3 of 3 modes and can choose the same mode multiple times, choosing between drawing a card and losing a life, dealing 1 damage to each creature and planeswalker you don't control, or putting a land from our hand or graveyard onto the battlefield tapped. Then, for something a little different, we have Tiller Engine, which, whenever a land enters the battlefield tapped under your control, we can choose to either untap that land, or tap a non-land permanent an opponent controls. So we can use this to really ramp up the moves we can make with the lands we return from our graveyard, or use this as a wacky, like, Icy Manipulator, tapping down the scariest of our opponent's permanents. Then we have a handful of board wipes, with Vandalblast, which can destroy a target artifact we don't control for 1 red mana. But if we pay its overload cost, we can destroy each artifact we don't control. And Fade from History has each player with an artifact or enchantment make a 2/2 bear token, and then it destroys all artifacts or enchantments. And finally, we have Azuri's Predation and Starstorm, the former making a 4/4 Phyrexian Beast creature token for each creature your opponents control, which of those tokens then fight a different creature, which can clear out our opponent's boards of smaller creatures and is likely to leave our board with at least a few of the beasts remaining. And Starstorm is an X mana spell dealing X damage to each creature, but if we don't need a board wipe that game, it can be cycled away. Now, Soul of Windgrace does basically give our lands cycling and can return those cycled lands to the battlefield, which does give us some card advantage, but it doesn't really refill our hand as it empties, so let's go over some card draw and card advantage spells to help with that. For some one-off draw spells, we have Read the Bones and Harmonize, with Read the Bones having us scry 2, then draw 2, and then lose 2 life, and Harmonize simply lets you draw 3 cards. Endless Atlas will let us draw when tapped with 2 mana, but it requires us to have 3 lands with the same names. As I'll get into a little bit later, nearly half of our lands are basics, and between those that will naturally draw and our land tutors, getting 3 of the same basics, especially forests, shouldn't be much of a struggle for us. Seer Sundial lets us draw whenever a land enters the battlefield under our control, provided we pay 2 generic mana. And Colossal Majesty lets us draw a card at the beginning of our upkeep if we control a creature with power 4 or greater, of which our commander has 5 power. And finally, we have Valakut Exploration, which isn't exactly draw, but it is still card advantage. Whenever a land enters the battlefield under our control, we exile the top card of our library and can play that card so long as it remains exiled. However, at the beginning of our end step, cards exiled with Valakut Exploration go into our graveyard, and Valakut Exploration deals damage to each opponent equal to the number of cards put into our graveyard this way. Arguably, the text on the card wasn't the most clear on that ruling, but regardless, this can be a good way to get access to some extra cards, get some lands into our graveyard, and deal some damage while doing so. But that's the last of our spells, so let's start moving on to the other half of this deck, which is our lands. I'll start by going over some draw lands, which we can sack to draw, then use Soul of Windgrace to bring back to the battlefield to repeat the next turn. This includes the Hunter Maze, the Dross Pits, and the Autonomous Furnace, which can be sacked with 1 generic and either a green, black, or red mana respectively. And we also have Cryptic Caves and Roadside Reliquary, the former letting you draw if sacked with 1 mana, but you need to control 5 or more lands, which is not a big hurdle for us with this deck. And Roadside Reliquary lets you draw if you control an artifact, and then you draw if you control an enchantment. Then we have some land tutor lands, including Evolving Wilds and Terramorphic Expanse, reskins of each other that can be sacked to tutor a basic land onto the battlefield tapped. Riveteer's Overlook is immediately sacked when it enters the battlefield, then tutors one of our basic lands onto the battlefield. And it works especially well in this deck since Soul of Windgrace returning it tapped doesn't change that it'll tutor immediately upon re-entering the battlefield from our yard. Jund Panorama is also a basic land tutor, but it costs 1 mana to activate. And Myriad Landscape tutors for 2 basic lands of the same type when sacked with 2 generic mana. Then we have Barren Moor, Forgotten Cave, and Tranquil Thicket, which can be cycled for less mana than Soul of Windgrace's cycling ability. Then Gruul Turf, Rakdos Canarium, and Golgari Rot Farm are bounce lands for a bit of mana fixing. Digraz's Caldera is also a bounce land, but it doesn't enter the battlefield tapped, and it taps for any Jund-colored mana. And Savage Lands just taps for Jund-colored mana. Colony Garden makes a 0/1 plant creature token when it enters the battlefield. And we also have Temple of the False God, which, given our heavy focus on lands, we shouldn't really struggle to meet its requirement of having 5 or more lands to use. I just wouldn't suggest keeping it in your opening hand. And to help us get some damage through on players, we have Rogue's Passage and Kessig Wolfrun. The former can be used to make a creature unblockable for a turn, and the latter has an X mana cost activated ability that gives a target creature plus X power and trample for the turn. Now, I somewhat neglected to mention an aspect of our commander and this deck that may be a little spicy for some pods. Soul of Windgrace just says to return a land from a graveyard, not just your graveyard. So, if you can get an opponent's land into their graveyard, there's nothing stopping us from taking it for ourselves. And so we move to some land destruction lands, which we can sack, destroy an opponent's land, take that opponent's land using Windgrace, and then in a later turn, we can return our land destruction land back for another round. We can start with Tectonic Edge, which for 1 mana can be sacked to destroy a target non-basic land, but your opponent needs to have 4 or more lands before you can do this. Encroaching Waste costs 4 mana to sack and destroy a target non-basic land, and Memorial to War costs 4 generic and a red to sack and destroy a target land. Notvold Slumber Mound costs 3 generic, 2 green, and a red to sack, which will let us destroy a target land, but for that huge cost, we also get to make a 4/4 Troll Warrior token with Trample. And our last land destruction land is Ghost Quarter, also probably our most efficient of these lands, which can be simply tapped to sack and destroy a land, but that land's controller may search their library for a basic land to replace it with. Now this is definitely something I'd say to rule 0 with the pod, as some people may not be okay with playing against land destruction at all, and this is something that could be fairly easily removed if you don't want to play with land destruction yourself. And I'd probably just replace these 5 lands with like 3 extra forests, a mountain, and a swamp. But aside from these lands, we'll fill the rest of our deck with 13 forests, 5 mountains, and 5 swamps, as this deck definitely leans towards green mana pips. But Now that we've gone through all 100 cards in our deck, let's take a look at that price. And as you can see here, this deck is currently sitting around $43 at the time of recording, including the cost of basic lands at 10 cents each, but not including the things like shipping, taxes, and the like. And now, I'd like to go over a handful of upgrades you may wish to consider for this deck. If you're wanting to lean more into, or upgrade to more efficient, land destruction, there's always Strip Mine and Wasteland. Blasphemous Act is always a solid board wipe that can be frequently cast for a single red mana, but it doesn't have cycling, so it could be a null card in your hand if you don't happen to need or want a board wipe in that game. Abrupt Decay and Assassin's Trophy are some great Golgari interaction spells for general problem removal. Blossoming Tortoise from Wilds of Eldraine can really help us get more lands both on the field and in the graveyard. And although this particular deck doesn't focus on making land creatures, I could also very much see that being a viable build path that Blossoming Tortoise would support very well. The Gitrog monster can give us access to a good amount of draw, as we'll be looking to frequently put lands into our graveyard, and Soul of Windgrace can help us retrieve some of those lands we put there. And Morog, Fury of Akum, can be quite powerful in this deck, as you get an additional combat phase whenever you have a landfall triggered during your main phase. But that's just a selection of the potential upgrades, and regardless, if you'd like to build, adapt, upgrade, or play with this deck, the link as always is in the description down below. If you liked the video, consider giving it a like, and if you'd like more budget commander decks, maybe drop the channel a sub. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.